Perfect. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming to our Echo session today. My name is Dridra Castillo, and I'm in my last semester of my entry-level doctoral program, and I am researching the effectiveness of this virtual program to increase your confidence and knowledge on various topics. Today, there will be a 30-minute presentation and a real case study for discussion. You will learn from one another and will have your knowledge re-examined through a local lens. Through shared support, guidance, and feedback, this will lead to a collective understanding of how to implement the best occupational therapy practices across diverse settings. This program is free and available due to your participation in this research study. Therefore, it is highly encouraged that you complete any survey links you receive before and after the session. You will not receive a certificate of attendance unless you complete the pre- and post surveys sent to your email. If you are not receiving these survey links, please let me know. I will send my email in the chat and I will make sure you receive the links. If you have any questions, again, my email's in the chat, and I would now like to introduce Madonna Nash.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here today to present the contemporary practice model in NDT, which is always changing. So it's always good to look at theory in terms of what's current and then application into practice in terms of current NDT. I think one of the things that for me, as a therapist who's been working in pediatrics for over 40 years, is that NDT, because of the problem-solving aspect of the approach, always changes. But for me, no matter what child I'm working with or adolescent or young adult, the model helps me to be able to assess and provide a comprehensive treatment plan in a very sequential manner so that I'm working on tasks that are specific to the functions that they need to participate in the environment. So I think one thing that the NDT approach has given me as an occupational therapist is to look at postural control, to look at biomechanics and kinesiology, and apply that to task analysis, which we're going to do today, to look at activity and how we can, in a sequential manner, treat children and adults. So let's get started. There's my email. If you have any questions after this presentation, feel free to email me. Okay, so let's get started here. So please do not copy or reproduce any of the pictures or information. The families have shared and signed a limited consent for me to use this, which doesn't give anyone else permission. So thank you for that. So what is NDT? So for those of you that might not be aware, there is an NDT book that was written by the instructors, coordinator instructors, occupational therapists, and speech pathologists within the NDT Association, and published in 2016. And right now, that book is being redone because, as you know, things change, which is very important in life. So that can be used as a reference for you. So what is NDT? It's a holistic and interdisciplinary clinical practice model that's informed by current and evolving research that emphasizes therapeutic handling. So parts of the team can be a physical therapist, occupational therapist, speech pathologist, but if needed, we can also bring in a physician, social work, psychologist, whoever that child or young adult needs to be able to participate in their environment. Our handling is based upon movement analysis for habilitation and rehabilitation for children and adults that have central nervous system pathophysiology. So here you can see Casey Hertz, a physical therapist, is working on postural control, and I'm helping her by working on the distal upper extremities so that we can do some preparation for alignment. We'll talk a lot about alignment is one of the first things you want to be able to put into your treatment. NDT uses the ICF model, the International Classification of Functions model, so that we apply this to a problem-solving approach to assess activity and participation so that we can identify and prioritize relevant integrities and impairments as a basis for establishment of achieving outcomes for our clients and for their caregivers. One of the things I always love and never get tired of is looking at typical as it relates to neural atypical development. So within that, we have to have an in-depth knowledge so that that can increase our ability to understand movement throughout the lifespan, but also help us not only with our evaluation, but also our intervention strategies. So if we look at the pictures to the left, you see this beautiful 6-month-old who's sitting with a very straight spine. Again, alignment is very important, so that she's able to flex her humerus forward and reach for a toy. If we look at the young man on the bottom, we see that his alignment is very outside of a base of support, which should be his ischial tuberosity, so that he can sit up straight like the baby. But we have to start to ask ourselves questions. Why is he sitting like that? Are his hamstrings tight? Does he have limited ability to move the pelvis forward over the femur? Does he have problems with balance? Is that why he's holding on to his legs? So the NDT approach gives us this ability to problem solve and ask us these questions of why and what is happening, so that then we can create strategies that will help him with alignment. So one of the big ones for older children is to get them up on surface and off of the floor, because gravity is not their friend. As any of you might know, when you're sitting on the floor and if your hamstrings are tight, you might have the same sort of positioning. So as we talked about, NDT uses therapeutic handling during the evaluation and intervention process. This consists of a dynamic reciprocal interaction between the client, the therapist, so that you can have optimal activation of sensory motor processing, task performance, as we can see in the slides, and skill acquisition for achievement in participation in meaningful activities. So this is Lee, he's going to be sort of our model that we talk about throughout this presentation, so that you can understand the different types of strategies that we're using to create postural control, balance, and equilibrium, as well as distal control needed for participation in meaningful tasks. So in NDT, it's all about participation and function. This is definitely different from a historical perspective, if any of you know that, but we're not going to get into that. But just know that we're always looking at participation and function. So let's look at assessment. When we look at assessment, we're going to look at the application of the International Classification of Function model, the ICF model. The ICF model was developed to have uniform terminology so that we would have a standard language to communicate about the concept of function, so that we can define it and also measure it. So if we look at this from the NDT perspective, we're going to look at body structure and functions, individual functions, and social functions as it relates to activity limitations, participation, and participation restrictions. So we're going to always take this from looking at the big picture, what do we see, and then breaking it down into components so that we can have a close-up view, or what are some of the primary impairments that are interfering with the integrity of the structures of the body. What are some of the multi-system impairments or compensations that our clients use that interfere with some of the structure and functional integrity of the systems? We also have to look at contextual factors. So the environment can be either a facilitator or a barrier in terms of participation, and also personal factors as well. So if we want to look at examples of this, we can use this diagram to look at participation is at the top. We're going to break that down into components of looking at strengths or abilities, restrictions or limitations, so that we're always having this equation of function equals task equals activity, which is really, as an OT, is not a difficult thing to do because we're so task-oriented. So in our assessment using the ICF model, we determine the session goal, and we use SMART goals so that they're measurable. We do a pre-test at the beginning of the session, which is related to the goal. And we'll explain this in detail more when we look at our task analysis. We then ask why do we look at that goal? What are some of the multi-system behaviors or impairments that the client is demonstrating that interfere with that pre-test? And then we determine the single system impairments. So we're going to look really specifically at posture, upper extremity function, fine motor. Depending upon the task, we might need to look at the rib cage in terms of respiration. We may need to look at cognition for a specific task. So all of the different systems, we try to determine what impairment is interfering with that task. And then at the end of the session, we do a post-test to determine what did we achieve during our session, what do we still need to work on, and then identify those things that might need to be worked on in future sessions. So some examples of multi-system impairments looking at posture and movement behaviors. We're going to look at atypical alignment. We're going to look at the relationship of the center of mass to the base of support. Any type of atypical patterns of weight bearing, as we saw the young man weight bearing on his sacrum versus on his ischial tuberosities and sitting. Atypical muscle and postural tone. Postural control and balance, which we're going to talk about. The kinesiological and biomechanical components of movement. Coordination and attention to the task. So one of the primary principles of NDT is to look at postural control, because we know that postural control serves as a basis, a pivotal role in all of gross motor behavior and the basis for all of our movements. Karen Adolph, who's a psychologist in New York City, studies infant development, and she says that postural control emerges from the interaction of a growing body dealing with the constraints of the physical environment. Postural control involves controlling the body's position in space for a dual purpose of stability and orientation. This is from Shumway, Cook, and Wollicott. Postural orientation controls our alignment of our body and its relationship to the environment. And postural stability controls the center of mass as it relates to our base of support. And these are the ABCs of NDT: alignment, base of support, center of mass, and the ability to shift the weight over the base of support. So alignment is a key in the distribution of the force of gravity, so there's no stress on the skeleton. So you can see here, nice alignment for brushing teeth. Sitting on the ischial tuberosities, the sacrum and the pelvis are in alignment to the hips. When you're not sitting on your ischial tuberosities and sitting more on your sacrum, this creates flexion through the spine. And so you can see then the upper extremities, because the scapula has no stability on the rib cage, are going to have difficulty with doing any type of task away from the body, with movement of the arms away from the body. There are three types of balance control that are necessary for postural control during functional tasks. Those are steady state balance, reactive balance, and proactive balance or anticipatory balance. Steady state balance is exactly what it says. It's the ability to maintain stability during stationary activities, for instance, in sitting and in standing. Reactive balance is the ability to recover a stable base or position after an unexpected perturbation. So here we see unexpectedly, she falls backwards and she uses a nice direction-specific response of her arms and legs to recover. Here we see on an unstable surface, loss of balance, and then a stepping response to recover. This is reactive balance, reacting to a perturbation in your center of mass. So we can see examples of reactive balance will lead to protective responses and in order to be able to assist us in our response to the change in gravity. Anticipatory balance is activation of your postural muscles in a feed-forward manner, so it happens prior to the voluntary movement. This is where you anticipate the destabilizing forces of the movement. So we can look at examples of putting on a jacket. You can see the postural system is setting itself up to stand up, to have good alignment as she puts her arm through the sleeve and then orients her center of mass so that she can find the sleeve in the back, which is sometimes a difficult task. And then she has success. Okay, we're not going to go through all these. Throwing,
Throw it up and over the top.
throwing and catching is another anticipatory feed forward response that's necessary in order to project a target in space. So you have to have good balance control to do that. Therefore, all tasks have a component of stability and orientation, which vary depending upon the task and environment. Remembering that postural control requires integration of our sensory systems, visual, vestibular, and proprioceptive, to produce stability and mobility for balance. Where does postural control begin? It begins with visual fixation and localization, which drives extension through the spine for head lifting and turning in prone. So here we can see a newborn and a 2-month-old doing this movement, which is critical for postural control and balance of trunk flexion with the extension. So you can see the pushing through the arms gives that ability to activate the flexors with the extensors against gravity. We also see here with a 4-month-old how that extension develops all the way down through the hips with ability to hold the head up. And you can see that visual targeting leads the movement, vision leads the movement that drives the postural system. So in a 3-month-old and also in an 8-month-old, we see that ability to move through space now to access a target that's out of your reach. Now they can move through the environment on their hands and knees to access that object. Requires good balance of flexion and extension in all the planes of movement at this point: sagittal, frontal, and transverse planes. So vision with vestibular information gives us control of eye movements, postural control, and perception. We also know that from 6 to 7 months, the postural control in sitting opens new opportunities for learning and exploration, so that the hands no longer have to be a weight-bearing or support surface, but affords the child or baby the ability to examine the properties with their hands, since they don't have to use them for support. So here you can see very nice postural control. The arms can move away from the body in space to catch the bubbles. And even though the arms are moving, it perturbs her balance, but she has good reactive balance and anticipation, so she doesn't fall over. This continues throughout development for creeping on your hands and knees, accessing a toy through your visual system, and then moving into a sitting position to be able to play with that toy.
Yeah, clean up.
Okay, postural control in walking alters the visual environment. So compared to crawlers, walkers move more, they see more, they play more, and they interact more in their environment and with their caregivers. So there's a lot of exploratory and social behavior that's shifting now since the child is able to walk against gravity. They spend more time communicating with their caregiver, therefore experience more frequent emotional interactions. So going to mom to offer her some banana, really nice communication and social gesturing. So what are some red flags or suspicious symptoms, impairments that we see in postural control with distal compensations? The biggest problem that we're going to see throughout the lifespan mostly is a wide base of support. Due to disorganization in the postural system, this is a typically developing child, due to problems in balance of flexion and extension, weakness in the spinal extensors with the abdominals, you're going to see a wide base of support is used to try to give some type of external stability. This is seen in older children, in ring sitting, and also in a W sitting position. So again, we can see how this affects alignment. And if you're sitting with a wide base, you're not going to be able to move, only in the sagittal plane. Our spine and our rib cage really require transverse plane or rotary movements for our highest performance of motor tasks. Okay, and you can see like during performance of participation activities, writing, taking off your shirt, being able to open and close containers, you're going to see this malalignment through the upper extremity based upon the postural system, but also now based upon the postural shoulder girdle musculature, which is not affording the distal movements to come in. So treatment using the NDT contemporary practice model is task-specific training. We know that evidence in the science of motor skill learning and neuroscience of experience points to the value of task-specific learning to promote plasticity in the brain. And very familiar to OTs is task analysis. So we use, OTs brought task analysis into the NDT model, and we use this process to observe a client in action, to observe how they perform a task, and then to be able to break down that task into smaller component parts or pieces in order to achieve an intended goal using a logical progression. So what we ask ourselves these questions: what participation goal are they trying to achieve? That's the activity. And then how do they attempt to achieve the goal? That's their ability. In the task analysis model, it ensures that you're going to look at function and participation. There are two components to the task analysis model. The first is assessment, where we ask ourselves, what are the components that are necessary for the task? If we can't watch somebody doing the task typically, then we can do it on ourselves to realize the components. And then the second question we're going to ask when we look at our clients, which assessed impairments are interfering with completion of the task? So if we look at the task, we can see here, we're going to do this in our case study. What are the sensory and motor components necessary to complete the task? We want to analyze the task itself and all the subtask components that we could work on. For instance, how did you get the pitcher in the glass? Where was it in the kitchen? How did you navigate the kitchen cabinets or the refrigerator in order to be able to get the pitcher and the cup? So if we look at the task very quickly, we can see very quickly that both hands are performing different functions. The pitcher hand has lots of abduction of the humerus with pronation. The hand that's holding the glass has lots of external rotation of the humerus with forearm supination, wrist extension, and a nice cylindrical grasp. So this bilateral or bimanual task shows that there's good integration of both sides of the body in order to be able to perform the task with good postural control and standing. He doesn't lose his balance when he does the task. So when we're looking at what are the sensory motor components that interfere with completion of the task, we also want to look at the abilities of the client. So if we look at Lee here, we see that pouring from the picture looks very different from the young man that we just saw before. So instead of having that nice abduction of the humerus to pour, he's using his body to stabilize the pitcher, possibly because maybe that it's too heavy for his non-involved side. He has a diagnosis of left hemiplegia, but we all know that when we're treating children with hemiparesis, we know that both sides of the body are involved in different ways. He's having difficulty controlling the flow of liquid, difficulty controlling humeral abduction with the internal rotation. On the left side, which should be holding the cup with a cylindrical grasp, we do see that humeral abduction with internal rotation versus the external rotation. Biomechanically, pronation goes with internal rotation, supination with external rotation. So we see he's using pronation. He has wrist flexion with ulnar deviation and a palmar grasp versus a cylindrical grasp. So let's look at some treatment ideas using the task analysis model. In treatment, we're going to look at 4 different components in the task analysis model in treatment. The first is preparation of the sensory and motor components necessary to complete the task. The second is simulation of the task through play. That is replicating or mimicking the task without actually working on the actual task. The third is practicing the skill for repetition and motor learning. And then the fourth is carryover for the home program. So this is an example. There's lots of ways you can work on preparation, but you always want to think, am I working on alignment? Do I have the base of support stable? Is the center of mass working in alignment? Is there dissociation between the top and the bottom? The shoulder girdle, the pelvic girdle, the right from the left side? Is he able to shift his weight? What sensory systems are involved? Does he have good self-regulation? Is he able to modulate the flow of sensory information into the nervous system? And does he have good praxis, the ability to motor plan and sequence the task? Simulation, again, is replicating or mimicking the synergistic movements of the task. So you want to imitate or model the activity used for practice and learning. And also, this is where play activities are used to structure learning so that we can develop repetition without the stress of the task. Play activities are designed to replicate the task using the exact kinesiological or biomechanical components. And we usually establish a play theme. So here he was Bob the Builder. So he was mixing cement in order to be able to build a house. Donald Newman, who is a great kinesiologist and has written several books. Understanding kinesiology, or the groups of muscles that work together to control repertoires of movement, are most important in working on a task. So you can see how this play activity of pouring from a cardboard roll into a tube simulates pouring from a pitcher into a glass. We want to practice the skill. These practice activities help us with knowing what is the goal and transferring our knowledge to the task. Kaufman talks about how many practice sessions we need to be able to learn the task. So 10,000 or 20 hours, which is about 45 minutes every day for a month, which we often don't have in therapy. So that's why the home program is most important in your treatment. So we want to look at practice in terms of deliberate practice, establishing a task, breaking the task into the components, giving feedback, aiming high to move out of the sagittal plane and keeping the motivation high. And then we want carryover. So if we look at giving a task of watering plants, it requires that same nice bilateral integration with the same kinesiological components necessary to do the task. Ooh, thank you for your attention. Any questions? Did we have any questions in the chat?
I don't see any in the chat, no.
Oh, there was somebody missed. There's some connection problems. Sorry about that. I don't think it was here. I didn't seem to lose connection, but. Okay, so the next part is the case study. Okay. All right, I'm going to share. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see faces.
Oh, we just got a question.
Okay.
They asked, what is the difference between task-oriented approach and NDT, both using task? They both use a task analysis, I think.
Probably the way in which we use task analysis may be different. I'm not sure that task orientation, is that what the question was? Task oriented approach?
Yeah, task-oriented approach and NDT.
Yeah, so for me, I'm not familiar with the task oriented approach. I think that might be just working on the task. In NDT, we're looking at the quality of the task based upon biomechanics and kinesiology. So we're not just teaching a task with compensations. The alignment has to be priority and biomechanics, because if we let a client work on a task with compensations, it builds biomechanical constraints. And that usually leads to joint restrictions, fascial restrictions, and then eventually surgery, which usually diminishes function. So NDT really looks at the component of posture with biomechanics and kinesiology. I would say that would probably be the difference than looking at just a motor learning, task-oriented approach. Okay. All right. So I have 5 minutes for this, right?
Yes,
right.
and
That's
then,
what.
yeah, once we get to the questions, we'll break out into the breakout rooms.
Okay. Okay. So can you see that the screen? So this is Lee. You saw him already. Meet Lee. Is a 6-year-old boy, adorable, who suffered a hemorrhage during delivery, resulting in a porencephalic cyst and a diagnosis of left hemiplegia. He lives with his parents. He has an amazing nanny who brought him to therapy twice a week for 2 to 3 hours a session. He attends a regular elementary school with a great teacher that worked with us as a team. He has a 8-year-old brother, an older brother, who he looks up to, and they do many things together. So this was his participation goal. During the spring and summer months, Aaron, Lee's brother, organizes a lemonade stand so that he can raise money for his Little League baseball team. And this summer, Lee would like to help him with the lemonade stand. So that means he needs to be able to pour from a pitcher. We already looked at Lee has weakness on his left side and his difficulty coordinating bilateral activities. He would like to be able to pour lemonade from a pitcher into a cup so they can serve his prospective customers. So when we think about this as a participation, it's a great participation goal. And if you wanted to make that a SMART goal, you could definitely look at the whole task of being able to hold on to a cup. You could look at the components of supination with wrist extension, a cylindrical grasp on the left side, and then specify the movements on the right side so that he can do this task 3 out of 4 times without spillings, in a certain amount of time so that we can give it a time frame as well. So here, just to look at a compare and contrast to see the difference of neurotypical and Lee that's having trouble with this task, you can definitely identify what he needs to work on in therapy. So when we're looking at the task analysis model in NDT, we want to identify the essential components necessary to perform the task. And usually you could have a large list. You want to sort of narrow it down to the top 3 or 4, because that's usually in a 30 to 45 minute, maybe 60-minute session, all you're going to have time to work on in treatment. Okay, so we watched him do that. So we're going to watch Lee to see what are some of the obstacles that are preventing him from doing the task. Okay, so you can see he has nice praxis to try to figure it out, but the motor control in his left upper extremity does not afford him the ability to hold that cup with good supination. So he said, okay, let me see if I can reverse it and try to pour from the pitcher with my left hand, but it's too heavy. So that is not successful for him. Okay, so you can see and identify what are some of the impairments that are interfering with the task, the top 3. I'm going to let you do that. I could tell you, but we'll do that in our breakout sessions. And then we're going to start our treatment. So in our treatment, we identify the impairments that are interfering with the task. Then we're going to treat the postural system first, because that serves as our basis for movement. So we want to think of what 3 preparation strategies, motor and sensory, can we use to prepare him for the task. So this is one example of upper extremity weight bearing on a mobile surface in order to get activation of the shoulder girdle muscles, the triceps, and the wrist extensors, with the long finger flexors being lengthened. Then in our breakout sessions, we're going to want to think about simulation strategies. So meaningful activities within the context of play that strengthen repetition and brain plasticity. So if you're not familiar with Andrew Huberman and Huberman Lab, I would listen to this. It's a great discussion on play and how to improve your brain. And then you have to practice the skill. So treatment requires practicing the motor skill, which is essential for learning. How are you going to do that? You can look at any temporary adaptations that you may need to put in during the task. And then the suggestions for carryover for the family to practice at home. Okay.
Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. I know my group had some really good conversation, and so I hope everyone else did as well. And so I will go ahead and ask Maggie, what did your guys' group answer for the first question?
For our first question, we talked about maybe motor control, kind of praxis as well. So being able to understand skills and organizing skills as well. And then also even maybe range of motion limitations.
That's great. Adonis, did your group have anything different?
Well, we talked about grasping the campaign picture, body strength, self-confident with the task, body position awareness, stability, concentration, attention, and visual perceptual skills.
Great. Okay. And then the second question is, what do we see as obstacles? Madonna, did your group have any insight into that answer? or into that question? Oh, you're on mute.
They focused on two aspects, the aspect of being able to have enough strength in the right arm to hold the pitcher and actually move the humerus so that he could pour with internal rotation and pronation. And then the left side of having difficulty with external rotation, specifically supination of the forearm with wrist extension for the cylindrical grasp. Identified weakness in the intrinsic muscles of the hand and the abductors of the thumb.
That's great. Yeah, our group discussed limited range of motion in the shoulder, as well as synergy between the shoulder and the wrist and the elbow. And what I thought was interesting is discussion of like maybe a lack of confidence that will later result in lack of participation in that task or in other tasks that are similar.
Yeah.
The third question are, what are 3 strategies for preparation for the task? Lindsay, did your group have anything?
Yeah, we had a good conversation about this question. So some people mentioned starting off with like some upper extremity weight bearing exercises, just working on getting some sensory and motor input into both our upper extremities, and then looking at positioning and alignment, and just like some other natural context and kind of making some observations there. And then also it was mentioned like working with therapy or Play-Doh with different like resistances just to kind of build up some strength in the hand and give some more input there. And then they also mentioned like you could play some games looking at grasp. And someone mentioned this is kind of simulating as well, but like holding a ring and then making sure you can get it high enough to like stack on a cone, some things like that.
That's great. Adonis, what about your group?
Well, we would suggest throwing, catching ball, using a quiet room without distractions, jumping, and generally brain gym activities and proprioceptive input.
Great.
Can I add one thing about those
Yes.
activities? Because you usually have such a short time in your treatment session, you want to make sure that your preparation simulation activities are really directed to the movements that you need for the task. So for instance, if you're going to do jumping activities, that's really far from the task. So preparation activities need to be really specified for bilateral upper extremity, both hands doing a different function type thing. Does that make sense? So even throwing is really not the same synergies that you need to be able to hold and to pour. So we want to think about what types of activities where we're integrating both hands in the midline have to be used. Throwing would be, we talked about this in our group as well, throwing would be for a task where you have to get the arms away from the body, like being able to put something up onto a cabinet. Then you might want to work on throwing. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. We had a discussion, which was for the simulation, though, with pool noodles grasping and fighting. I think this is much better activity.
Oh, yes, that's closer.
Preparatory.
Yes, definitely. You have the same kinesiological movement. So if you're holding the pool noodle, you have that supination, the cylindrical grasp, and you're working, in and out of the midline a little bit. So yeah, that's good.
Kudos, Andrea.
All right. And then one of the other questions was how we could simulate or mimic the task. Madonna, did your group come up with any other examples of how it could be simulated at home?
Yes, someone mentioned this, but doing a Play-Doh, just the idea of holding the cylinder of Play-Doh in his left hand and then having to with resistance, take the putty out, and then maybe making a cylinder and then some balls that have to go into the cup would directly simulate that in your treatment session. Another person talked about working on the intrinsic muscles and getting more isolated control of the fingers. So putting objects in therapy to work on intrinsic control. Yeah, so that was it.
I agree. We had a lot of discussion about using Play-Doh or like resistive putties. And then we also discussed like inserting beads onto a dowel, but also considering like if they don't have that fine motor control, having to kind of take a step back and targeting that as well. And we'll do one last question was, what would you suggest to the family for them to practice at home? Lindsay, did your group come up with anything?
Yeah, so we were thinking about some just like natural contexts at home where you can do it. I know you mentioned like watering the plants, but even just recommending that they give Lee an opportunity just to practice pouring everyone's drink like at dinner or something like that, because that would happen daily. So that would be a good way to get some daily reps in.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And with that, it is 2 o'clock. And so our session is now over. Thank you all very much for participating. And thank you so much, Madonna, for providing all this knowledge. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. So thank you for volunteering your time.